Reality. What a concept. One gets the impression sometimes that the people in charge don't actually pay much attention to what's going on in the world. Three profound examples of this have been floating around in the last few weeks. From across the globe and across time, we've been hearing the most convoluted nonsense about Afghanistan, about Cuba, and about China. Let us debunk these topics one at a time. The most recent, in terms of length of time the problem has been ongoing, is Afghanistan. In early November, Secretary of State Albright noticed that the fundamentalist Muslim nuts currently running Afghanistan have been, gasp of surprise here, discriminating against half the population. Albright discovered that the Taliban are sexist pigs living in the 14th century. Surprise, surprise. One might also have noticed that she didn't bother pointing out that the reason the Taliban are in power is ultimately because of the CIA. Somehow, when some people get to noticing problems around the world, they never seem to comprehend, or at least acknowledge, the causes of these problems, in particular their own role in causing these problems. It was people ideologically in line with Albright and the class she represents who brought religious fundamentalists to power in Afghanistan in the first place. Recent political history in Afghanistan is actually very straightforward, but the good secretary is obviously out of touch. 2 decades ago, the people of Afghanistan elected a president who represented the vast majority of the population. President Najibullah was devoted to the cause of people, and the CIA felt that profits would be threatened, so the CIA set about organizing and arming various fundamentalist groups from the countryside to overthrow this democratically elected government. Being a bit outmatched by the power of the CIA, the new government looked to the north and asked the Soviet Union to send troops to help put down this fascist coup being organized by the USA, bastion of democracy. These days, we're told that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, but the truth of the matter is that Afghanistan would have been fine, and the Soviets would have never been invited in if it were not for the CIA and people like Secretary Albright, who have ruined that poor country. And then there is China. Evidently some dissident got out of prison and went to Detroit. The corporate press has been filled with stories about how this guy intends to keep up his agitation for what some call human rights. Even self-described liberals get bent out of shape about China. I even heard the executive director of Amnesty International talking about the need to keep pressure on China because of the hundreds, maybe thousands of political prisoners still behind bars. Well, that much one cannot argue with, but let's keep a little perspective here. In our much smaller country, we have thousands, if not tens of thousands of political prisoners. If you count the prisoners of the war on drugs, there's hundreds of thousands of them. And yet no one hears the Free Tibet crowd arguing for sanctions aimed at forcing the U.S. government to release its political prisoners. I'm just sick and tired of the mindless hypocrisy of these so-called human rights advocates complaining about China. There are serious human rights issues in the world, and quite frankly, China is at the bottom of the list. Compared to capitalist countries, the Chinese are rank amateurs at human rights abuse. If you want to talk about violent suppression, forced disappearances, torture, slave labor, and a muzzled press, just look at Mexico today. On the subject of human rights and national values, let's look at U.S. relations with Cuba. Early November brought news of dozens of absurd plans to destabilize Cuba, formulated by our best and brightest in the decade after the Cuban Revolution. It turns out that the defense and intelligence people have been spending their time coming up with more and more absurd tactics for undermining Cuban sovereignty. The fundamental truth behind all of this is that the CIA and Alpha 66 have not been able to undermine the Cuban government of Fidel Castro because it is, in fact, among the most popular governments in the world. The CIA can do a lot, but in order to take over a government, they do need an in, and in Cuba there is simply so little real opposition that there is no one for the CIA to organize or arm. Those bent on imposing the free market are left to come up with the absurd. The alternative is to accept the democratic will of the Cuban people, but that isn't going to happen. The corporate press has called these plans dirty tricks, and keep in mind we only hear about the ones that weren't used. The plan that is the most telling was the one to sink a boatload of Cuban immigrants, real or imagined, and then blame the Cuban government. The disturbing part of this is that the lives of actual Cuban human beings are of no consequence to our government. Apparently this plan was not carried out because the CIA couldn't figure out a way to blame the Cuban government for sinking a boatload of human beings. No one would believe that the Cuban government would do such a thing, but to our government, murder is not a concern. Morality is not a factor of capitalist politics or international relations. Anyone who claims that it is either an ignorant fool or is lying. And here I'm thinking of... Oh, well, this is Richard Curtis.